I'm Dan Williams, a partner at the law firm Hutchinson Black & Cook. This is the first of our four-part series on the roots of racial exclusion in Boulder County and the road ahead. An event like this inevitably is a team effort. Here, it was made easy because we have an embarrassment of riches of great co-sponsors. We're incredibly grateful for the help, input, and support our co-sponsors have provided. And as you saw from our slideshow, the co-sponsors are the NAACP of Boulder County, blackpast.org, the Center for the American West, Native American Rights Fund, the CU Law School, and the CU Black Law Students Association. So tonight's discussion is the first of the series, and it's on racial bias and exclusion suffered by Black people in Boulder. And I want to begin by saying we're just overwhelmed by the response this panel series has received. Over 1,000 people have registered to participate tonight. And based on that interest in tonight's discussion, we know this is a conversation our community needs to have and appears ready to have. So before we dive into the panel discussion, I would just want to tell you very briefly the genesis for this series. The panel series germinated from the public outcry that arose around the country in the wake of the killing of George Floyd by Minneapolis police officers in May of last year. And as a law firm, we immediately did what was easy. We issued a statement in support of the Black Lives Matter movement. But we didn't want to just give lip service. Recognizing that Boulder is a community that regards itself as progressive, but has a dismal history with respect to being welcoming, safe, and supportive for persons of color, we looked at what we could do to change things. We looked internally about improving hiring practices and expanding access to legal services for people of color. And relevant for tonight, we decided to facilitate a public conversation in the hopes that changing the conversation on racism in Boulder and recognizing how we got here could help elucidate a path forward. So we hope this series helps our whole community to better understand why Boulder looks the way it does. We hope this series gives people of color who are participating in this presentation tonight reassurance that their voices are being heard. And most of all, we hope this series serves as a catalyst for all of us to forge a path forward. And it's a path forward that we hope does not look like the path that got us here today. So now let me turn this over to my partner, Kim Holt, who will introduce our moderator and our panelists for tonight.
Good evening, everyone. It is my privilege to introduce all of you to our amazing panelists and moderator. I'll begin by introducing Professor Polly Mclean, an associate professor in the Media Studies Department at the University of Colorado. Dr. Mclean's work has focused on intersectionality, issues of racialized representation, Africana women's history, and globalization with respect to Southern Africa. Professor Mclean has won many, many teaching awards, and she has served as CU's Director of Women and Gender Studies. She's currently at work on her new film, The Calling, which focuses on Black and white members of the Boulder community who traveled to Selma, Alabama in 1965 to join the march with Martin Luther King. Next, I'd like to introduce Dr. Charles Nilon. Dr. Nilon is the William J. Rucker Professor in Fisheries and Wildlife at the University of Missouri. In his work, he researches how urbanization affects wildlife habitats, populations, and communities. His research also examines how urban residents view neighborhood open spaces and environmental justice issues associated with access to nature. Dr. Nilon was born and raised in Boulder, and he attended the local schools from Whittier Elementary through Boulder High School. His father, Charles Nilon, also was the first Black tenured faculty member at the University of Colorado, and his mother, Mildred Nilon, was the first Black librarian at CU. Our third panelist, Penfield Tate III, has been a practicing attorney for nearly 4 decades and has held several high-ranking positions, serving as a member of the cabinet for former Governor Roy Romer and serving as a state elected representative and a state elected senator. He was also, a few years back, one of Dr. Nilon's classmates at Boulder High School. As many of you know, Mr. Tate's father, Penfield Tate II, was a Boulder City Council person and the city's first and only African-American mayor, serving from 1974 to 1976. And I'm excited to announce that for those of you who haven't heard, the city of Boulder is now planning to rename the municipal building in honor of Mayor Tate. Finally, I'd like to introduce our very distinguished moderator, Dr. Quintard Taylor. Dr. Taylor is the Professor Emeritus and the Scott and Dorothy Bullitt Professor of American History at the University of Washington. He specializes in Black history in the American West, a region that has not traditionally been identified with Black history and culture. His many publications include the book In Search of the Racial Frontier, African American West, 1528 to 1990, which was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize. Dr. Taylor has recently been busy creating blackpast.org, a new website that will quickly surpass Wikipedia, particularly with respect to Black history, and is on track to see 1 million visitors in February alone. And as my colleague Dan Williams mentioned, BlackPast is one of our wonderful co-sponsors for tonight. And with that, it's to you, Dr. Taylor.
Well, thank you, Kimberly, and I hope everyone can see me. We're part of this technological revolution called Zoom, and we're all getting used to it. Some are adopting to it more quickly than others. Let me say first that I am delighted to, and honored, in fact, to be the moderator for this panel. As you probably figured out, I am the only non-Boulder resident among this august body. And I hope that I was selected in part to bring perspective, and kind of an outside perspective on the history of Boulder and the history of Black Boulder and the history of African Americans in Colorado and, of course, the entire West. Before I get started with my brief remarks, because I want to get us right into the panel discussion, I need to take care of a housekeeping matter. It's something you always know or you always experience when we do these Zoom webinars. If you have any questions for the panelists during the presentation, you may use the Q&A function, the question and answer function at the bottom of your screen. I'm hoping that everybody will know where that function is to submit your questions. Your questions will be submitted and then they will be passed on to us. Please indicate whether or not your questions are for a specific panelist or for the entire panel. With that, I want to, if you can indulge me for a minute, I want to tell a story about Colorado. And people will say, well, you're talking about African American history in Boulder, and Boulder has never had Boulder's population has never been more than 1% African American. And so why is that significant? Well, I think I've got a response, I've got an answer to that, and that answer lies in Colorado history. Some of you may know that Colorado was rapidly settled in the 1860s. I think you know that story. And by 1863, there were probably 35,000 people in Colorado. Well, actually, you can see it on the chart, 34,277 in 1860. And the Black population was very, very small. But that population was changing quickly. There were more and more African Americans coming into Colorado, just as there were more whites coming into Colorado at that time. And the question of statehood began to arise. Will Colorado Territory, which actually had been known as Jefferson Territory before, will Colorado become a state? And of course, there were those who wanted statehood, but in the process, a strange phenomenon happened. Colorado in 1861 had actually allowed its small Black male population to vote. By 1864, white Colorado male voters had restricted African American voting. That is, they took away Black voting rights. Black people, and I want you to understand these numbers, Black people numbered about 130 people in Colorado at that time, that is 1864, but they quickly mobilized behind the leadership of a remarkable man, excuse me, William Jefferson Hardin. And Hardin was a barber who came out from Lexington, Kentucky, and he settled quickly in Denver. And he decided, and others decided, that this shall not stand. I'll make a long story short. Essentially, Hardin and the other all other leaders of the small Black community essentially lobbied the Republican leadership in Washington, D.C. And in 1867, when Colorado came up for statehood, the Republican leaders in Congress voted no. I want you to think about that. When Colorado came up for statehood in 1867, the Republican leaders in Congress voted no. They voted no for a variety of reasons, but one of those reasons was the fact that Colorado had denied statehood to African Americans. But it didn't stop there. Republicans in Congress, the leaders in both the House and the Senate, I guess they would be called radical Republicans, decided that they were going to make sure that this kind of issue would never come up in the West again. And so they passed in Congress the Territorial Suffrage Act of 1867. And that Territorial Suffrage Act guaranteed that Black folks, or Black men at least, would be allowed to vote in every territory in the Union. Now, I want you to understand the significance of this in terms of the chronology. In 1865, African Americans were extended voting rights in Washington, D.C. by Congress. Later in 1867, those voting rights would be extended to Blacks in the Reconstruction South. But earlier than Reconstruction, earlier than the voting rights being extended to Blacks in the Reconstruction South, Blacks in the West, Blacks in the territories would be allowed to vote. And they would be allowed to vote mainly because of the efforts of William Jefferson Harding and others right in Denver, right in the Denver community. I think that's a beautiful story because it shows that it doesn't take huge numbers. It doesn't take, large organized populations to challenge the status quo. I mean, that's always good. But in this particular instance, a handful of people, a handful of Black folks changed the history of Colorado and eventually influenced the history of the entire Black West, and in effect expanded the suffrage dramatically for all people of color. I'm sorry I took too long on that story, but I wanted to share it with you because I think it's a uniquely Colorado story, but it also goes to the question of what happens when there is a very small Black population. Can that Black population have input? And I certainly believe it can. And I think the panelists tonight are going to reflect on their role and the way in which that influence was rendered in the Boulder community over the years. So let me start, I'm running late here. Let me start with the first panelist. I want to welcome Dr. Polly Mclean, an old friend who's written for Black Past. We've known each other for a number of years. She will talk about her experiences as a longtime resident of Boulder, Colorado.
Hi. Hi, everyone. How are you? I do want to make one correction about my bio, is that I was at one time the Director of Women and Gender Studies. I am no longer that. So I just want to make that clear. Before I begin, I want to thank Dan Corson and Wendy Hall for their work in preserving Boulder's Black history, Dr. Patty Limerick and Lynn Gilbert for never giving up on me, Dr. Quintard Taylor for launching the first Black global encyclopedia, and members of the bar from the NAACP lawyers and those in private practice who took on the cause for social justice and the new community role that Hutchinson, Black, and Cook is undertaking. I must confess that for this event, I broke my Black History Month pledge. While I undertake and participate for the cause of Black history 12 months out of the year, I pledge to boycott the insults of Black History Month on the shortest, coldest month of the year. One that ties our history to capitalism, for example, Xfinity, advertising costly on-demand Black movies such as Bad Boys with Will Smith and Martin Lawrence. The city of Boulder demographics is very unusual and interesting to me. 1.57% of all adults 25 years and older have a BA degree. The national average is 29%. 37% have an advanced degree. All told, 70% of all adults have a bachelor's degree or higher. Number 7, Boulder's number 7, America's best city to live in. Number 3 on the 30 most creative cities in America. 9 best outdoor towns in the US, and the number 1 most bicycle-friendly city. It's one thing to listen to this panel who can share ideas of inequality, equality, and justice. It's quite another thing to move with action, both personal and collective, in undoing racism. And as a people, we like quick fixes, especially when something has an emotional, political bent. Because of you, we, the collective, is unlearning 403 years of a national system and 151 years of Boulder's history. The model that seems to be the easiest to follow is to stir in a Black face here and there and to wash our hands that we have arrived. I was invited to a dinner party in Denver where a Black male openly stated how happy he was to be back in Boulder because he didn't like being around those people. I finally had the courage and asked him, where was he living? And he told me, Washington, D.C., Chocolate City. Blacks are not a one definition people. Color is only one definition of who we are and not the only one. One would think that highly educated Black people would know better and could not be contributing themselves to systems of racism on a regular basis. We don't leave our culture at the door. It's what binds us together. The system of racism has become internalized, and the damage is bigger than the solutions, even more complicated. As a system of domination, racism can be manipulated because it's bigger than any individual. Highly educated people who sometimes know better contribute to systems of racial harm on a regular basis. On the other hand, we're talking about a community, Boulder, Colorado, that is highly privileged. The thing about privilege is that with privilege come power, and with power, whiteness rules. Before I begin, I want to make it clear from the time African Americans began to settle in Boulder, racism existed. It existed with the miscegenation laws that considered marriage between Blacks and whites a crime, and was finally void and a void until 1957 when it was repealed. Within the exception of miscegenation laws, Boulder racism was not the legalized racism that Blacks left behind in the Jim Crow South. Oliver T. Jackson was able to buy the Stillman Hotel and Cafe at 1028 Pearl Street. Not far from the Stillman's Hotel was John Wesley McVeigh's Iowa Barbershop and Pool Hall, which catered to both Blacks and white clientele. In 2002, I had the privilege of interviewing John's daughter, Helen, just before she died about the issues of racism. Helen said, I had both Black and white friends. The white friends were very nice to us. They came to our house, but we never were invited to their house. That was a horse of a different color. I guess we had racism those days, but we just didn't know it. Blacks usually stayed on their side of the street and whites on the other. What other way could racism show its ugly head? One way has been through policing. We are probably quite familiar with the arrest of Zaid Atkinson, a Black Naropa student, harassed by the police for picking up trash where he lived. And while many in the Boulder community were enraged and took the streets to show anger, this incident was not new. According to a female graduate student that I spoke to recently in preparing for this, she said to me, I got pulled over a few blocks from campus and told by the police that they were checking to see if the vehicle I was driving was stolen, since I didn't have a front license plate frame. I then went to all of my graduate classes, the Next Black Student Alliance, African Student Association, MACHA meetings, and asked if anyone else had been pulled over for similar stupid reasons, and found about 30 Blacks and brown students who had, including one Palestinian. Didn't find a single white student who had gotten pulled over. Love Boulder PD. Now, getting back to Helen, the Boulder police in the 1900s ironically had a policing strategy, or maybe a different policing strategy. When Mama found out that my brothers had gone to a party on a Sunday, which was a no-no, she called the police. The sheriff, Mr. Bass, went to the party, stopped the music, and loudly announced, "The McVeigh children, your mama wants to see you." More and more, I run into people who are shocked when I tell them that racism is not a thing of the past, but is alive and well and has always been in Boulder, Colorado. I would also add colorism as a factor, but that's for another webinar. In the midst of all of this greatness, there is a darkness that fell to the wayside, and one we shy away from admitting or even discussing, because Boulder racism is often quiet, subtle, and disguised. And if we do think about it, it's something in the past. Another Black student shared with me the time she walked out of a store on 28th Street and had two dumbasses, according to her, approach me. She said, one making gorilla-like noises and gestures, and the other asking me, what kind of movies does a jungle bunny rent? I was floored. They just used jungle bunny. Hadn't heard that such a word in a long time. Racism is endemic to the United States. The country was built on a racist platform. It is not erased in Boulder. Worried that my 5-year-old son in kindergarten was not reading as I had expected, I went to the public school to get some advice. When the teacher couldn't give me good advice, she sent me to the principal. The principal said I should not worry and asked me if I ever saw my son run. I was baffled by the question. He then proceeded to tell me that my son was a fast sprinter. I came to a discussion about his intellectual health. He flipped to sports. A year later, I found my son quietly reading Dante's Inferno to himself, and now he too is a law student graduate. I've lived in 6 states in America and as a young activist in some dangerous situations. And the only time I've been called the N-word twice was in Boulder, Colorado, at the corner of University and Broadway. Once by an older, homeless white male face-to-face, and the second time by a group of young white males from a car as I stood waiting with a white male graduate student across the street. But the N-word is not the only racism Blacks encounter in Boulder. There was a time I was invited to a faculty party at a very close friend's home. The only non-white, and standing in the sea of whiteness, trying to get acclimated to the scene, a white woman came up to me and with her arms stretched out, handed me her glass and asked me to put it in the sink for her. Black women, as the maid trope, still governs the minds of citizens even today, and fostered by recent Hollywood films such as The Help. Boulder is full of good intentions and well-meaning people. I do not want to diminish that fact. While maybe not the bastion of liberalism we would like to think of it as, it is one of the few places where something like this tonight can happen. But how can we each contribute to unlearning racism? Not all of us have the time or the energy for the big fight. And it's okay. We can't be all Dr. King. But do you correct that one cousin or uncle at Thanksgiving saying that racist joke? A co-worker. Do you embrace Tyrone when your daughter or son brings him home to meet the family? Racism is taught, but it doesn't have to be. Thank you.
Wow, wow. Dr. McLean, wow, that was very, very powerful. And I learned a lot. And I think we're going to have a very interesting discussion. There are some things that have been said on the chat room tonight that I think pertain to some of your remarks, or many of your remarks. And so we're going to come back to that. But next, I want to move on to Dr. Nilon. Want to give him an opportunity to talk about his experiences in Boulder.
Okay, well, thank you. Good evening, everyone. My name's Charlie Nilon, and I guess my connection here is that I was born in Boulder and grew up in Boulder. And first, I'd like to thank two people. First, my friend Penfield Tate, who actually asked Kimberly to include me on this. So I want to acknowledge them. And also thank Polly, who's been very active and really documenting the history of Black folks in Boulder, and interviewed my parents and a variety of other things. But so sort of my story is really a story that was started in the mid-1950s. And when we talked earlier to plan this, one thing that I thought a lot about was that I was born in Boulder on October 13th, 1956. And my parents moved to Boulder from Detroit on August 31st, 1956. So I was basically born a month after they came to the city. And one thing that I thought was really interesting was that when my parents came to Boulder, they were the start of probably a group of Black families who moved to Boulder in the mid to late 1950s and early 1960s that were sort of the second wave of Black people living in Boulder. And I grew up knowing people like Ms. Feaster, Ms. Flowers, the Emanuels, the Linghams, Ms. Chrysler, Ms. Anderson, Ms. Reeves, Mr. Hall, who were Black people who lived in Boulder from the early 1900s on. So in some ways, my experience was the start of a very different kind of place in Boulder. But what I grew up in was a community that had a long-standing Black community, the people I just mentioned, that had 2 Black churches, that had families that had kids that grew up in Boulder, went to Whittier, went to Casey, or at the time University Hill, went to Boulder High or Boulder Prep, and graduated and went to CU. So that in many ways, the things which happened to the Black community in Boulder that I experienced were not really unique. But again, to get to what was sort of, I think, happening was that Boulder was starting to change and that Black people were coming from other places to move there. So when I was a little kid, families like the Billups and the Bunches and the Inneses had kids who were older than me, and were in elementary school or high school when I was really little, who had moved to Boulder in the early 1950s and were there. And then a few years after I was born, our family was joined by families like the Davises and the Hensons and the Hardys and the Jacksons and a whole group of folks who Penfield and I went to school with and grew up with, and many of whom were still in Boulder. So that was sort of this transition. And I guess the way that I would describe it, I guess to maybe talk from what Polly talked about, was something I don't remember first, was that when my folks moved here, my dad was a professor at CU. He was the first Black professor at CU. And when he arrived, and he was followed shortly after that by another faculty member that Denver sent at the med school, and then a couple years later by Berkeley Edens, who was in the philosophy department at CU. But when my folks arrived, they looked for a house. And I think initially they were living in faculty housing on Athens Court over by Boulder High, because they were looking for a house. And for several years, they were unable to buy a house for about 2 years. And they had a difficult time finding people who would sell them a house because they were Black. And my folks said they were told things like, you should live on Gosson Grove and improve the conditions there. And as my parents explained to me, they said later on, they felt, that they'd moved to Boulder and they really didn't have to do that. So that was, I guess, something I didn't know about, but something I grew up hearing about. And so I think that sort of describes something what Boulder was like when I moved there. But in many ways, my experience was pretty typical of a lot of kids in Boulder. I grew up and went to Whittier, which was probably the most diverse school in Boulder when I was growing up. I went to Casey, which again was the most diverse junior high, and I went to Boulder High, which is the most diverse high school. And so as Polly mentioned, I have Black and white friends. I actually did get to go to their houses, but of my white friends. But I think that growing up, till I was about in high school, junior high probably, I view myself as being kind of in Boulder, and I think like most little kids, you sort of play with your friends and do your thing. And I think some things which I was aware of though were that, as Polly mentioned, my dad and Mr. Buggs went to the Selma to Montgomery March in 1965. And when I was in 6th grade, Martin Luther King was killed, and there was a big movement around that. And one of the things that came out of that, which I think really shaped my experience in Boulder, was that the Black community formed an organization called the United Black Action Committee. And one of the things that the United Black Action Committee did was they started a program called Freedom School, which we call Black School. It was the kids called Black School. And Black School met on Saturday afternoons at Boulder High, and we learned about Black history. And what that did, though, was in addition to helping us learn about Black history, it really brought together the Black community, because it brought together people who were at different schools, who didn't know each other, whose parents may not have been as close, and gave us a sense of identity and belonging. And moving into high school, we got to high school, Mr. Klein and Mrs. Beaudwy started effort to have all the kids, all the Black kids in junior high and high school, whatever school they went to meet every couple of weeks. So we started meeting every week, again, with the idea of bringing us together. And I think what that did was begin to really develop a sense of community and a sense of belonging, and a sense that really you are part of the Black community in Boulder. Another thing that was part of my experience, I think Penfield's going to talk about, was connection with CU, because my dad was at CU, my mom was at CU. I had a connection growing up with essentially many of the Black students, undergrad and grad students, particularly the grad students. So my parents said that, or my mom said one time that she had one son and many children. And I think a lot of her children were the whole range of Black undergraduate and graduate students that came to CU from roughly the 1950s through the 1980s. And again, the idea that my parents and the Tates and the Beaudwys and the Moores and many of the families in Boulder reached out to students. We had people in our houses for dinner. We sometimes had people staying at our house, a whole range of things with this idea of trying to form this community. So I think a lot of my experience is trying to form this sense of community. And I'd be very glad to talk in more detail about some of the things which happened, but I really wanted to focus again on this idea of community, because I think that's something that that I found really unique part of my experience, that I think that the ability to be in a place that on one hand was a very, very white space, and a place that could often not be very welcoming, we were able to handle that because of community. So for example, when we got to high school, and many of us had difficulties with teachers or with some of the expectations of some of the teachers of the administration, and occasionally with some of the actions of some of the teachers and so on, our parents really bonded together, spoke up for us, met with the principal, met with the teachers, those kinds of things. So I think that idea of being in a community that was gave you a sense of belonging, that gave you a sense of being connected was really important. The other thing that I did want to mention was that Boulder is very connected to, or the Black community of Boulder is very connected to the larger Black community. Through CU and through other activities, we heard speakers, we heard a large range of people. So for example, we were in high school, several of us went up to hear Huey Newton talk about the Black Panther Party. And we heard people like Stokely Carmichael. When they came to CU, we were involved in a lot of the activities. I remember going when I was in 7th grade to the Big 8 Black Students Conference that was held on the CU campus, and watching the Battle of Algiers in one of the theaters on campus, and really being, again, connect with that kind of broader community. And finally, I'll end with really this idea of being reminded that things which are happening now happened in the past as well. When I was in probably just starting high school, there's a gentleman in Colorado Springs who's a professor at the Colorado Springs campus, the CU Colorado Springs campus, who was shot and killed in a gas station. And one of the things which I remember was going with my dad and a few other people up to campus to a meeting with the Black students there, and where the students were talking about this whole thing of how could a Black man be shot in a gas station by an employee of the gas station who was a Fort Carson soldier who was not charged and then transferred out of state. And I think that in many ways, that sort of event and some other things which happened really started giving me a sense of, I guess, my identity of what Colorado was like as a place, because I always viewed Colorado as a place that I loved, a place I was connected to, a place where you could ski and backpack and be in Boy Scouts and look at wildlife and do all the things I like to do. But that other piece about saying your identity as a Black person in Boulder was something that I think developed over time. It's always been something that I felt closely. And I think that that connection to community and to that history in Boulder has been really important. So thank you, and I look forward to asking more questions down the line.
Well, thank you. I mean, this is fascinating. I mean, Polly starts us out with a discussion of how racism sort of permeates the society. And Charles talks about how people resist that racism through community, through building community. So I'm looking forward to the discussion. I think we're going to have some interesting exchange, an interesting exchange of ideas. We'll hear now from our third panelist, Penfield Tate, who has a number of distinctions, but the most important is that he's the son of the first and only Black mayor in Boulder. And I hope you will talk about that and talk about what life was like for the son of the mayor in Boulder, Colorado here.
Sure.
Penfield, please.
Thank you. And first, let me also, as was done earlier, thank all of our sponsors and thank Kimberly and Dan for all of their hard work in putting this together, and Yesenia for her support. And I like the topic of this conversation where we're talking about racial exclusion in Boulder County, the history of it and the road ahead, because I think to understand the road ahead, you have to have an understanding of where you've been and what the history is. My story overlaps Charlie's in a way, but it's different. And mine is different because unlike Charlie, I wasn't born and raised in Colorado. My dad was in the military before we came to Colorado so he could do his third and final year of law school. I was raised an Army brat. So I literally lived all over the world the first 11 years of my life, including a stint in Europe. But more importantly, in my background, I was born in Philadelphia. I started elementary school in the Chicago public school system on the South Side in an all-Black elementary school, and graduated from high school at Boulder High School, one of 4 Blacks in a graduating class. Charlie and I were the only 2 African and Black males in the graduating class. And I reference that it's important because he and I used to always joke that even when we were in high school, people would confuse us. Now you can't see both of us, but Charlie is well over 6 foot and I'm south of that measurement. I'm a little chunkier than he is. He was much thinner, and they still couldn't get our names straight in high school and growing up. And even when we went to reunions afterwards, people still confused us and couldn't get our names straight. Now, and I'm not saying that there's anything malicious about that. It just is part of the lack of paying attention or just not acknowledging, in some ways, your innate humanness if you're one of just 2 Black people in the class, Black males, and people can't remember you. The other thing I'd offer is my family moved to Colorado in 1967. It was after I said, as my dad got out of the military, and when we came to Boulder, we didn't have the housing issue that Charlie and his parents had, because as a married student, my dad and our family, we were placed in Chautauqua Park in one of the cottages, because Chautauqua was for a time the married student housing for CU students. So the first year of the last year of my dad's law school experience, we lived in Chautauqua. And I will say, just like Charlie experienced, it's one thing to be born in Philadelphia and live on a bunch of military bases and urban centers. But when you arrive in Boulder in the middle of the night and your parents carry you to bed and you wake up in the morning and see Chautauqua Park and the Flatirons in your backyard, it is really a life-altering experience. And I also began a love affair with the outdoors, and I still fly fish and hike and do things to this day, in part because of what I was exposed to there. The other thing that I think is important about my experience in Boulder is the time period. As I said, we came in '67. And so, this was the height of the anti-Vietnam War movement. This was the growing outrage with regard to the civil rights movement. It was also the hippie experience, and young people saying, if we're old enough to go to war and die, why can't we vote? So Boulder also became a converging point for all of that, which generated a different sort of environment than you saw in a lot of other places. And it was difficult for the city because although Boulder was perceived as the liberal bastion of Colorado, and it probably was, relatively speaking, it was not as liberal as people thought. When school wasn't in session, the Black population of Boulder dropped dramatically, and it became what it was at its core, which was basically a rural community with a major university dropped in the middle of it. So there were always these competing forces in the city that you had to, as a young person, navigate through. But the times, I think, sort of created circumstances. As many of you know, my dad ran for city council in 1971, just 3 years after graduating from law school, was elected to city council. And at the time he ran, he got the most votes of any of the candidates who ran. 2 years later, he was elected by the city council as mayor of Boulder. He was not the first elected Black mayor of Boulder. He was the second, because Ms. Ida B. Evans in Fairplay was elected mayor of Fairplay, I think a month or maybe 2 weeks before my dad was elected mayor of Boulder. So she was the first elected mayor in Colorado. But I think it was a sign of the times, because Fairplay was less diverse than Boulder was. So Ms. Evans becomes mayor, then my dad becomes mayor. Shortly after that, Odell Berry gets elected mayor in North Glen, and that was not a particularly diverse city. And it wasn't until '91 where Wellington Webb gets elected mayor of Denver. And so, it was a transitional period of time, and things sort of moved in that fashion. The other thing I would note, and it's something that Charlie referenced, is how intentional our parents all were collectively about creating a sense of community for us, even though there was no physical proximity. When I started sixth grade in Boulder, there were 3 Black kids in the entire elementary school. When I started junior high school, there were 4 of us. And when I started high school, there were about 6 of us. The most Black students I ever went to school with was my junior year in Boulder High School. We had 17 Black students, and that was only because CU had a program where it affiliated with HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities, and invited some of their professors in over the summer or for a period of time to work on teaching methodologies and methods. So we would have this infusion of different students, but it was only a year at a time. So it was never a particularly diverse school experience. Quintard, you asked about what was it like growing up the son of the mayor. It was difficult. You already stood out as one of the few Black kids in Boulder. And some of your friends didn't really want to associate with you because if they did things that were normal things that teenage kids did, they didn't want the mayor's son with them because it would attract attention. But my best friends, we hung out together, we worked together, we socialized together. But there were times when I was stopped by the police. I was stopped driving while Black. And, they ask for your license and registration and they look at the registration and they're like, uh-oh. And they hand it back to you and say, slow down or be careful or do something. I never had an incident where I was physically mistreated, but I know there were times when I was watched and watched carefully and followed. To Polly's point, I tell people it's interesting. When I left Boulder, I went to undergrad at Fort Collins at CSU before I went back east for law school. And I tell people to this day, I was called the N-word more in Boulder than I ever was in Fort Collins. That was not the experience I had there, even though Fort Collins was even less diverse than Boulder. But the other thing I would just offer, and then I would like to have some more conversation, is Boulder, as Charlie mentioned, we had a number of families that actually owned businesses also in Boulder. The Stevens had a cleaner up on the hill. Mr. Tarzan Honor had one of the few Black-owned shops, if not the only one, on Pearl Street before it became the Pearl Street Mall. And so we did have some businesses there. We did have some support systems, but we had to create our own sense of community. The last thing I'd offer is I want to circle back to sort of where I started. Oh, no, I want to say one other thing first about CU. CU had the opportunity to be a major positive influence in terms of race relations in Boulder, but I think on a number of occasions it missed the mark. What really drove CU's exposure was its athletic programs. I think Coach Crowder, who was the longtime football coach during the time I was growing up there, had the ability to recruit Black athletes, but they were often outspoken about what they thought was an unfair system. Coach Walseth, who coached basketball for many years at CU. I grew up with his son. He was never able to recruit Blacks from the Denver public schools for whatever reason. They wouldn't go to CU, particularly to play basketball, although he could recruit Black students from out of state. And to this whole idea of community that Charlie talked about, the Black school and everything else our parents did wasn't only for us. One of the things my parents did, and part of my dad's background, is when he was an undergrad, he was a college football All-American, the first All-American at Kent State University. And so he understood the life of a student athlete on a predominantly white campus. And so when we were in Boulder every summer, we used to host a cookout at our home for particularly the incoming Black athletes and any of the other Black students who wanted to attend. And sometimes some of the Chicano students, and that was the terminology of the time, Chicano students would come to the house also for the cookout. And sort of the highlight of the point of the cookout was my dad would often sit the guys down and tell them, you're an athlete here. People are going to know who you are. You're going to be visible. The police on campus and the police in the city are not going to receive you well. So you need to watch how you behave. This isn't Detroit. This isn't Philly. This isn't Texas. You can't do some of the things you did where you're from. You've got to be careful and protect yourself. And so that was something that he did. He also helped the university recruit Black students as well. So there was that ongoing tie and relationship to the university, although the university police were problematic, to say the least. Last thing I'd offer is this, and I think it's the road ahead. I think we all need to pay attention and be conscious. One of the things that, again, Charlie and I commented about is when we were growing up, our fathers sued the Elk Club in Boulder because they had a policy of requiring that you be an Anglo-Saxon Christian male to be a member of the club. And so my dad and others sued and lost the lawsuit to try to take their liquor license and eventually shut them down. But as part of our graduation, they insisted on holding some of the events at the Elk Club and even some of our reunions. And so I still never attended many of those events. And when my classmates or former classmates would ask me why, and I tell them, it's always, yeah, I kind of remember hearing something about that, but I really didn't know what it was about. The point now is we all need to know what it's about. And I think in this current environment in our country with George Floyd and other circumstances, it behooves us all to pay attention. Thanks so much, and I look forward to questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Penfield. I want to get us right into the questions. This is kind of the open discussion, and I'll use my prerogative, my privilege as the moderator to ask a couple of questions. And I don't know how difficult they're going to be. And you two, the three of you have covered so very much that it's it's kind of a challenge for me to try to frame some of these questions. But I've got to reference something that Polly said early on. She talked about racism being a constant, even in a place like Boulder. And I'm going to confess, this is something that the audience doesn't know, but they should know. The first comment that came up tonight in the chat was the N-word. It was just the one word, that's it. And, quite frankly, I was very surprised to see it. But on the other hand, it speaks right to the questions that we're dealing with right now, that racism isn't somehow or another something that happened in the past. It's something that continues right to this moment. With that in mind, let me ask this question. One of the things about race and racism is that it changes over time. Can you speak to that in terms of your own experience, your own history here in Boulder? Obviously you guys aren't old enough. You're not even as old as I am. You aren't old enough to go back to the 1950s or earlier to kind of understand that history. But you all, at least I'm assuming, I don't know, Polly, I don't know when you came to Boulder, but Penfield and Charlie, you were here in the 1960s. Was there a difference in the 1970s or the 1980s as opposed to the 60s? Maybe Penfield, who's been here throughout this entire time, can speak to this. What's the ebb and flow of racial animus or racial tension in a place like Boulder?
I think when I first moved to Boulder in '67, the animus was probably more open and outward and visible. Those who wanted to call you the N-word just called you the N-word, and that was just it. And I want to be real clear. That was a very small number of people. The vast majority of white people I dealt with in Boulder, they never treated me that way or acted that way. I always knew, living and growing up in Boulder, that I was Black and I was different. But I think over time, what I saw was that outward hostility subsided. I will say, I think that as we moved into the 70s and the 80s, it lessened a bit. One of the things I've seen, and I live here in Denver, but I still think it speaks to what's happening in Boulder, and it's going to sound trite, but cable television has changed a lot. Because what I have found is young kids growing up, and the millennials exhibit this and generations after them, there was a merger of popular culture. It's like a lot of Michael Jordan's fans aren't just Black kids. Not just Black kids buy the dopest tennis shoes and the most current tennis shoes on the market. Kids today from all cultures, in many respects, in urban areas in particular, they all listen to the same music. They all watch the same videos. They all go to the same concerts, and in large measure, they dress alike. So there's actually, I think they're less conscious, and unfortunately for African-American males who I mentor, they don't see things.
Mhm.
They don't see racism sometimes when they're confronted with it because they don't have the tools to understand it anymore. They just know something's happening to them and they can't understand why because it's so discreet. It's so covert. They just don't have the coping skills and the cues to pick up on it. So I think that's changed societally. I will say that the last 4 years of the prior occupant of the White House changed that. I think it became much more overt around the country, which is why we saw what we did with Black Lives Matters and a number of other things last summer.
Mhm, mhm. Charles, you want to speak to that?
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what Penfield said. I think, well, I'll tell a quick anecdote. I thought it was kind of interesting that my mom lived in Fraser Meadows about the last 10 years of her life. And whenever I go out to see her and I'd be bringing stuff or taking stuff out, she'd always say, she'd always tell me about being careful walking in the halls carrying stuff in Fraser because people, because I'm a Black male. My mom go, Mom, I'm like, almost 60, so probably they're not going to think I'm, stealing stuff. But I think she felt very aware of this idea of, that people still view you as being Black. And I'd agree. I mean, I think that was true growing up. I remember, because I grew up a little bit earlier, in Boulder, and remember, some things. I remember a white friend whose parents had a friend who clearly did not like Black people, and it was always interesting going over there and that interaction and things like that. And I was a little kid, and I go, "Wow, this is really strange." But so yeah, I agree. I think that's changed. Because I teach at university now. I think Polly could probably talk about this as well. That I think much what Pim's saying about sort of how students interact and those kind of things, and I think that kind of lack of awareness of the white students of what they're doing, of what they're saying, how they're and how they're responding to things, and how the Black students perceive that, and they don't really understand what they're perceiving. I think that's definitely true. But I would say I think that Boulder changed while we were there. I think Boulder changed while we were there. I think some things have changed. I think as Boulder became a lot wealthier, that changed some things, and I'm not sure. I think probably the people who still live there would be a better judge on how that worked, but I think that brought out some different kinds of things in the community that maybe weren't there before, that could be maybe, well, they may not be racist, they definitely have a racial sort of component to it. And I think that idea of sort of, I think that Boulder's perception of itself changed a lot. That became very consciously now this very progressive liberal place. And I think sometimes people are a little surprised at seeing that. But I think sometimes people don't see some of the things which are still going on. But I'm saying that as an outsider, and that's one of the lives, so that's more my perception.
Wow. Polly, I don't know if Polly can see us. Polly's mic is muted. Polly, we can't hear you, Polly.
Hi.
Okay, here we go.
Okay. All right. I think one of the things when you're looking at the different eras where folks settled here, the first a group of settlers came, they were Europeans. They weren't people of the Jim Crow South. They were people who came from the northern part of America, and they had and that's why when Helen talks about, there were some differences, but we played a lot, we got along a lot, they came to our house. We didn't go to theirs, but they came to us, it's important to understand. So then when you're looking at the 60s and 70s, you're looking at the hippie movements who came through here. And they, of course, brought a different flavor in terms of what it was to be an American, the embracing and all of that. Now we're at a different, again, a different moment in time in terms of looking at who is settling here now and from where and what's going on. And I think that's a piece that I've been playing with a lot. in terms of looking at the population shifts that has gone on here and what how it manifests itself.
Well, let me follow up on that and talk about population shifts and changes in the economy. We haven't talked very much about the economy. I'm an outsider, and I guess I assume that Boulder is a classic university town. I've visited the town a number of times, and it seems to me that the university physically dominates the city, you know, and certainly I imagine culturally and in some ways economically dominates the city. But I also get the sense that from at least the 1970s, maybe in the 1980s, there were new industries that came to Boulder. There were new job opportunities. I certainly see this in some ways in the population increase. You guys don't have these figures in front of you, but between 1970 and 1980, the Black population doubled. The white population increased by probably 15 to 20%, but the Black population doubled. And I wonder if there are some kind of economic forces that are at work that sort of explain that influx, or in addition to that, whether or not the change in the economy changed the nature of Boulder and the nature of life for African Americans in Boulder.
You know, I think it's several things. I think the nature of the economy in the state has changed intentionally. The state of Colorado and the Denver Metro Chamber of Commerce and others intentionally, after the recessions of the 80s, sought to diversify the economy of the Front Range, including Boulder County and the state. So Colorado's economy is much more diverse. It's much more high-tech focused. The university has grown, but my perception, and I still have two sisters who live in Boulder, so I visit Boulder pretty frequently. My perception is that while the university is a major player in the city, over time with the growth of IBM drove a lot of the diversity that you saw in the city because they actively recruited people of color to come work for them. And they were insistent that they be able to buy houses in Boulder. But I think, you know, that you've got the whole tech movement, the whole tech industry, entrepreneurialism growing in Boulder, so that although the university is still a significant force, I think Boulder's economy has diversified tremendously. It has brought a whole different type of people and persons to Boulder that has sort of changed its trajectory.
Yeah, I would agree with that totally, that, you know, we always think the university is the one, but it's the city that is really influenced. You know, and I talk about the university as a city within a city. You know, they have all the elements of what creates a city. You know, health, banking, the opportunities to work, and all of these things, cultural, etc. But I think that Penn is right in terms of the other elements, and we have to acknowledge also some of that change probably come from the immigrant population that has moved in. And that's across, and looking that there may be more people from continents or areas that has made some of that change evident.
I'll agree. I'll add that I think when Penn and I were growing up, a lot of kids who went to school in Boulder High, both a lot of white kids were, their parents had been there for several generations. They had people whose parents had been there for a long time, and that was pretty typical, And I think Boulder was more sort of, I think Boulder High especially had more of a mix of kind of backgrounds where people's parents were from. And I was even trying to think of the Black community, that I think the Black community, in terms of a lot of the
third of the Black Boulder High
working, and there were people who worked, who were mechanics and did different things, a lot of different kinds of backgrounds,
African,
and who were the parents of a lot of Black kids. And I think what we saw was like Penn said, that just that change of Boulder becoming a lot wealthier and a very different kind of community. And I think that's changed a lot. I think the Black community reflects that too.
Okay.
And I think one of the things that happened is, and I think this is controversial and many will disagree, but I think there were times when, Boulder's not unique in this respect. Many governments do this. It's the whole doctrine of unintended consequences. When Boulder tried to limit growth and have a zero growth ordinance and things of that nature, my observation is it did two things. It began a rapid escalation in real estate prices in the city of Boulder, which made it difficult for seniors to keep up with the cost of property taxes, but it also drove sprawl into the county. Even now when I go to Boulder and visit, when I was growing up, there really was no town of Superior. Lafayette and Louisville were farming communities. Primarily, now they're major suburbs. Broomfield was sort of like a bedroom community. It's now a city and county. And it used to be part of Boulder County as well as two other counties. But what you've seen is a lot of growth in the county surrounding the city of Boulder itself, because people had to move out in order, I think, to afford housing.
Now, and that affects the older Black community and the rise of the property taxes. How does it affect the ability of younger Black people to come? Can they afford to live in Boulder?
Well, I know. I think it's very
That's the
difficult.
problem.
But it's difficult for young white kids
Right.
also.
Right.
Boulder has in many respects become very
Right.
expensive. But let's be
Yeah.
fair, so has a lot of Colorado. One of the dynamics here in the Front Range is Denver used to have a large African-American population. Over the last 10, 15 years, that's all migrated. There are more African-Americans living in Aurora now than in Denver.
Wow.
And
Wow.
part of
That's
that,
what you're seeing here also, is that the population can't afford the $1 million houses here. Even the apartments are too expensive. So you live on the periphery, and work there and go back and forward. So I think that's absolutely correct. And that we don't, of course, think about, we assume that these populations all get are well connected. We assume that that folks from outside the United States are all loving everybody else. So I think we don't see difference. We see this thing called Black and assume that all Blacks are the same, and not recognizing the differences based upon your birthing, based upon the background of your family, based upon the wealth factor. We sort of don't pay much attention to that.
Go ahead.
One thing I observed is kind of the semi-outside of all this too is that just the whole growth of the Denver metro area has really changed, because I think growing up in Boulder, I don't know if people just thought this, when growing up in Boulder, it was Boulder, and then you drive 25 miles and there was Denver, you kind of go through Broomfield on the way, and there wasn't really anything in between there. And going, like, we were in high school and you'd go to like stuff, we go to a football game or something and drive down to Aurora. That was like going way out, but that whole sort of growth, and I think the fact now that people are scattered kind of throughout the metro area, I think that's changed the nature probably of the Black community in Boulder as well. That people live all over the place, and then they work in Boulder and live somewhere else. And so it's a big change that way, I think, too.
But the thing is, it's how we define community.
Yeah.
That's the big problem here. We think because you're a certain color, that means you're in a community.
Mhm.
And it doesn't mean that at all. I had a young person I just ran into in a store here today who graduated from one of the high schools most recently, and asked me, where do I find people looking like me? So, and we also had that when we had the Goss Grove area, thinking that that's community, and, but that also included whites, poor whites lived there, Latinx lived there, so we assumed this was the Black community. Well, sure, but is the question. What does that mean?
Well, let me explore for a minute that whole notion of the Black community and try to put an international dimension to it. One of the things that's happening all over the US is that there's a growing African population, African-born population in the major cities. Certainly that's the case here in Seattle. You must have some of that because you now have a young congressman from the Boulder area named Nagus. Am I pronouncing that correctly?
Right, yes.
Yeah, and he's of Eritrean ancestry.
Yeah.
Yes, fascinating. He became a star in the recent Trump impeachment hearings. And maybe Polly can speak to this. Is there an influx of people from Africa and Latin America? And when I say Latin America, I mean Blacks, especially from Latin America, into Boulder? I know you always have some because of the university, but is there an even larger influx of Africans into Boulder to change or to challenge the notion of what is the Black community?
Right. Yeah, mostly Africans, and they are probably, yes, there's some changes, and they come from particular countries. I mean, we know, and some of that has a lot to do with, immigration issues and whatever. But yes, you're looking at particular, look at Denver. We have more Ethiopian restaurants than we have anything else, and we also have one here in Boulder, Colorado. So we are seeing that influx of people from other parts of the world coming here, and it's to be expected.
Okay. This is fascinating, guys. I could continue to ask you questions all night long, but as the moderator, I'm supposed to open it up to questions from the audience. And let me say again that if you have a question, that you go to the chat bar at the chat icon at the bottom of your screen and use the question and answer function to raise your question. And if you will, to direct the question toward the panel or to specific members of the panel.
Quintard, I saw two questions I'd like to respond to in the chat.
Okay, please.
One person asked, when my dad was on city council and mayor, if his leadership was accepted and by the community, by the council, and did I ever have to defend him? And I would say yes, his leadership was accepted and respected by his colleagues on city council and I think in the community at large, with one big exception, which frankly ended his political career. When my dad and others sponsored the Human Rights Ordinance, it would have prohibited discrimination against people who were LGBTQ. That started a firestorm. There was an effort to recall him that was unsuccessful, but when he ran for re-election, he lost badly. And even the liberal Democrats in Boulder, when he ran for the legislature, he couldn't get the Democratic nomination. And so I spent time in high school having to defend my father because, it was a sort of a hyper masculine environment. And there were people who were critical of him for supporting, the Q part of LGBTQ. And I'd often have to speak out in defense of that. But I'd say that generally his leadership was respected. And I would say that probably his three proudest moments were sponsoring the Human Rights Ordinance, was moving Boulder forward with the Pearl Street Mall, which was built before Denver built his 16th Street Mall, and his advocacy for affordable housing, because Boulder didn't really have a lot of it. And my dad, with our pastor, the late Reverend Jim McCune over at St. John's Episcopal Church, started the San Juan del Centro housing development with the Learning Center off of Valmont. So I think those were key things that he cared about. The other question I'd answer real quickly is one person said, what can Boulder do to attract more Black people to move to Boulder? And I would say the one thing you ought to consider doing is striking up a very intentional strategic alliance with CU. You have a bunch of students you're bringing there for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years who are at least exposed to the community. I think that with some effort and some intentionality, you might persuade them to stay once they get their degrees. And I think, and that would then generate potentially, and Polly and Charlie, I'd appreciate your thoughts. If there were a larger Black community, you might have more success in attracting more Black faculty, and then you might have more success in getting more Black students to come and attend and potentially stay when they matriculate from the university. Just a thought.
I think that's true. I think that's true. And I wanted to, I'll just say from my experience here in Missouri that, Columbia is larger than Boulder, but also has a larger Black community. And I think that has been a connection in recruiting students and that kind of, and faculty here. But I wanted to comment on one question that several people ask about, and Polly, I think probably was about this too, about the Gossan Grove neighborhood and also about where people are. So, so the older community was there. So one question was, what about the people, I guess when they're saying the older Black community, I think they're probably talking about, say, the people that grew up with us in the 60s and 70s and 80s. And I think that at least for the people of our generation, I would think a lot of them are still in the Boulder area. I mean, would you say that's true? Probably, Penn, that a lot of the people that we grew up, I mean, I think that individual people moved away, but they're a core, they're still here.
Yeah, I think there are still some people there in town. As I said, 2 of my sisters still live in Boulder.
Yeah.
And they've got some folks they socialize with from the time we grew up in Boulder, going back to the 60s.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think so.
And again, a reminder, like I said, that's for the people that would still be alive, who'd be like our generation, a little bit older, that's not that many people either. I mean, that's like
that's true.
People. But and the other question about Gossan Grove, and so Gossan Grove was where many people in the Black community lived, although not exclusively, because I know when I was little, most of the people who still live down there were older. So people like the Reeves, and the Reeves who related to the Morrisons, who they're playing by George Morrison, that's his family. Miss Anderson, Miss Chrysler, and those were folks who were probably in their 60s, 70s, probably at the time I was a little kid. But even then, the Black community was probably spread out more, even in the 50s, because the Langham lived on Bluff, and some of the Emanuels lived other places, and there were people living in Martin Acres because Martin Acres was already built. So even by the mid 50s, people were starting to move other places because the Williams who developed Martin Acres sold houses to Black families. And then I know my parents' experience was trying to buy houses in places like around University Hill, near where a lot of faculty lived. And I think that's where they really had a difficult time. But the Gossan Grove neighborhood, though, was the area where a lot of Black families lived. And that essentially disappeared and became student housing and other kind of housing in the mid 60s when Canyon Boulevard was built, and was built from Water Street, and they did a lot of redevelopment and things in there and put apartments in. So that was probably the mid 60s when that really disappeared.
The Goss Grove neighborhood had a combination of ethnic groups living there.
Exactly.
There's this perception that it was a Black neighborhood.
It never was.
I mean, I think, this is facetious and crazy to say, but the most Black people that I know right now are buried in Columbia Cemetery. Please, people, think about this. So the Goss Grove neighborhood, we associate, and people have been working, trying to save the houses the Blacks lived in, I must tell you. But they also live outside of that. They'd never all lived together in this community. What brought them together often to build community was the 2 churches that eventually became one, okay? And the events that happened in people's homes. The McVeighs, for example, were musicians. And they brought people together for, for them when they played the drums and played the piano and hang out. So you had this community, but you also had the community. So it was a combination of things to understand. And one assumes, that having that meant you had a neighborhood. When IBM came in here, one of the things was, we don't want to be having our people segregated. And it was IBM who said that to the community of Boulder, the powers that be. And therefore Blacks can live wherever. So they were spread out a lot. And we have to understand that, and the connection also with Denver was an important one, because they went to Denver for events early and later became also the place. So I know people who come here and can't wait to live, and it could be financial, but they want that other flavor that Boulder doesn't give, and therefore they want to go to a place like Denver to live. And the faculty come here, and it's not too long that they end up in Denver living. So that's not unusual for me in terms of the space and the place.
Folks, we're running short of time here. So I want to get a couple of other questions in from the audience. This is one, and I'll just read it. It says, for any of the panelists, the city of Boulder recently enacted a racial equity plan. A few passages generated controversy at the council, where they asserted that Boulder's history of land use planning, including growth limitations and the green belt, have contributed to racial inequity. Do any of you have a view on on this question?
I'm going to say this very cautiously. So, yeah, I mean, land use planning in any major urban area is going to impact, or has the potential to impact, efforts to drive diversity. Part of it's income generated. If you increase the cost of the housing stock, you're in many ways and in many communities, you're limiting and eliminating a certain cross-section of the community, which can often be disproportionately people of color. But I would also say you have to be, I think, very cautious about a couple of things. And actually, this is more Charlie's field than mine. I think it is erroneous to assume that you either have open space, green space, natural space, or you have diversity, that they're mutually exclusive. They are not. And we're actually having that battle right now in my neighborhood in Denver, where there's a drive to develop a bunch of open space in what is a historically African-American community. And a number of us are saying, no, we're good with open space. And if we know we need affordable housing, but it can be built in other places, you don't need to plow up the only open space, major open space we have. So the land use planning, I think it takes on a number of different dimensions. You have to look at where you want to build density also, because that also helps drive affordability.
I've got another question. Let me ask a few more questions here. As a relatively less diverse community, how do you recommend people in Boulder become better allies against racism and oppression against marginalized groups? I think that's an important question. Who wants to tackle that one? Again, how do you recommend people in Boulder, and I guess the assumption here is non-Black people, how do you recommend people in Boulder become better allies against racism and oppression against marginalized groups?
It starts at home.
I think
that starts at home.
Yeah.
If you cannot do this, by thinking outside the home. When your home gets in order, then you're able to move out.
Challenge your racist.
And that helps, that works against that racist element that you learn and is built up. So you have to start that at home.
And part of it is speaking up and speaking out.
Mhm.
Too frequently people see something and say, oh, isn't that a shame? Oh, isn't that too bad? Well, rather than say it's a shame and too bad, do something about it, or at the least say something about it. Because the person who's often targeted gets marginalized, and if no one comes to assist, the situation never gets better.
Another question, another quick question, and this one is for you, Polly. Dr. McLean, what has been your experience in Boulder as a professional Black woman?
I leave a lot to stay. That's what I usually tell people. So I'm always on the road. I'm always in another country. I'm always somewhere else working. It's been difficult. It's been difficult, and it hasn't stopped being difficult. You know, the assumptions that people, you know, assume you're about, you know, the fact that you may talk differently, that you may argue differently, that you may look at something differently, and there isn't one way to look at it, is certainly problematic. And the fact that, I can assure you that up to, a couple days ago, I experienced a racist issue. It just doesn't leave you. It's there. And I don't think sometimes people think of it as racism. I think it's just part of their nature. And they have, again, go back to the home. They haven't yet learned what that means. And I think that follows a lot of students that I have had contact with across, the states that I've lived in, so yeah, it is problematic.
Let me raise one other question. I think we've got just one more question before we turn it over to Dan Williams. And I'll read this question. We hear that Black and brown people really don't feel safe in Boulder today. Some have had some experiences with the police, and others have had experiences of hate speech and hate acts. It seems that this has been happening steadily during the whole of Boulder's history and has been increasing in the past number of years. What can we do as a community to make Boulder safer for Black and brown people? Let me read the last sentence. What can we do as a community? And I guess they're asking you what the entire community can do to make Boulder safer for Black and brown people.
I kind of go back to Polly's last comment about things starting in the home. One of the things that I have noticed over the years in Boulder is the school system, and parents talking about what they perceive to be racial segregation in the school system, trying to steer students of color to particular places. And gosh, I guess about a month ago, I was in Boulder doing a program with another group, and one of the people working on the project described to me, I guess, a situation that had just occurred in one of the Boulder schools where an African-American young girl was verbally assaulted. And the parents were outraged because the school administration wouldn't deal with it. And the parents of the offending kid actually took offense that someone wanted to discipline their child for behaving the way they did. It's those sorts of things that you have to deal with. I don't know all the facts. I'm just telling you what I recount, but it's an overused phrase, but sometimes you have to have a zero tolerance policy towards nonsense. And a lot of that is taught at home.
Anybody else want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I want to. I think part of it is, I think it's maybe recognizing, which I think also comes from home, that being progressive politically doesn't necessarily mean that that your community is more racist or less racist than other places. And I think that idea, like Penn said, that people still act in ways that can be harmful to Black and brown people And even though they may hold political beliefs, so it's, you know, that you think would be counter to that. So I think it's that idea of really being aware and recognizing what's happening, really speaking out about what's happening and trying to be, I say speaking out more is probably the key.
The one thing too, I think we need to also acknowledge and get people to think about is that we have been fighting this as individual groups separate from each other. We have not yet developed that style, and it was here at one point, it disappeared, that people need to collaborate and get together in order to fight the monster. You know, so if you want to get action going, you can't just say this is the Black thing, okay, or this is the brown thing, or the Asian thing. You know, it's that you have to work in a collective environment. And that is something when we are not taught, we have to learn.
Wow.
You
That's
know,
powerful.
Polly, if I might, to that last point, I remember when Charles and I were in high school, we had some instances and issues at the school where the principal convened meetings with us and our parents, and the meetings were titled having to meet and deal with the Black problem.
Mhm.
There are only 17 of us. How can we be the problem? We
It's
wanna
the white problem.
we're talking about what we're experiencing, and the meeting is about the Black problem.
Right.
Words, they matter.
Yeah. Yeah.
Words matter. Absolutely.
Yeah. That's probably a good place for us to stop. Words matter. And even more importantly, actions matter. And I think the lesson from this panel to all of the people of Boulder and all of the people of Colorado, and perhaps all of the people in the country, is that you have to take action to stop the pattern of racism, because if you don't take action, it's just going to continue.
But you see,
and it's right here and right now.
yeah. And to see, the thing that happens is that we begin to do that, exactly what we're saying. And once we gain one little something, we stop it. You can't just stop something that's been going on for what, 400 or something years?
Right.
150 years in Colorado? That's a long time to make change in a short time.
Okay. Well, we're going to turn this over to Dan, who's going to wrap it up for us.
A huge thank you to our panelists. This was this discussion just far exceeded my expectations, and I hope it exceeded all of your expectations. So, and Charlie, Polly, thank you so much for being our panelists, and Quintard, just a fantastic job as moderator. You know, I think I learned a huge amount. I'm sure everyone else listening did as well. You know, the concepts and the things that you talked about in terms of community and what it takes to build community, the degree of racism that you still experience in Boulder today. These are things that we're going to be thinking about for a long time, as we should. Just by way of wrapping up, I mentioned at the beginning, this is the first in a series of 4 panels. The next one will be about the experiences and exclusion of Native American people in Boulder. Then a panel on the experiences and exclusion of Latinx people in Boulder. And finally, a forward-looking discussion on how Boulder can begin to create a more inclusive community. And we will be sure to keep everyone on our email list now updated about the subsequent panels. Shout out is definitely in order for blackpast.org, and you should visit the site. Just poke around on it. There's so much great information to learn. It's www.blackpast.org. Blackpast is one word, BLACKPAST. For Black History Month, BlackPast has a goal of 1 million visitors. They're at around 900,000 now, so we should at least get them to 901,000 by the end of the night. Definitely worth your while. This program in its entirety is going to be rebroadcast on KGNU this coming Wednesday, March 3rd, starting at 8:35 a.m. We are also, in collaboration with CU Law, going to put the recording on YouTube, and we'll have a link to it on our website, and we'll send out an email notification about that. For the lawyers among you, this program is eligible for CLE credit, and there was a link in the email that we sent you earlier today. to get the CLE form off our website. There's a button on the bottom of the page if you click through that says CLE form. So click through, claim your CLE credits. And then last but not least, I really want to thank CU Law and especially Lucinia Delgado for the amazing support pulling this program together, because it never would have happened without the technical assistance and support that none of the rest of us on the team had. So thank you so much for that. Thank you everyone for coming, and we hope you continue to participate in this important conversation as we move forward. So have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.